If your head was full of onions, you would be sad too.
Hi, I'm George the Antique Nomad. Come with me as I wander the country in search of valuable vintage, amazing antiques, and cool collectibles. We'll buy, sell, and trade at antique malls, shops, and shows, estate sales, flea markets, thrift stores, anywhere people go to find really interesting things that just aren't made anymore. So come on, let's go!
Hey everybody! I'm George the Antique Nomad, and it's good to be back with you. I've just returned from a trip to Florida where I picked up a lot of consignments and did some shopping as well. You saw one video where I went through the Treasure Hunt Antique Mall in Powder Springs, Georgia, and I then went on to pick up a lot of things from consignors and also did some shopping. I've got some more videos to come out, but I wanted to do a haul video with you because I have so much new product, and a lot of it had to go on eBay right away because I just am so inundated with new stock. So I've got things on eBay that are closing in a day or two. I have things that are just going to list at the end of this broadcast, so you'll get to be the first to see them, but I wanted to get this out in time for you to have a chance to look at anything that you might find interesting and see how it's doing out in resale land. Those of you who've watched me for a while know that I'm an antique dealer and I conduct estate sales. I also buy and sell at shows and in malls and in other locations. And I'm very excited that we're back to being able to do this again. So let me show you some of what I got. This vase has a magical property. So I'm seeing a lot of these birds outside my door these days because we're at the end of spring and the cardinals are definitely having fun together, just like these two here. This particular bisque porcelain piece was done by Andrea by Sadek. Andrea by Sadek is a company that's been around a lot longer than you might think. I'm going to show you the label on the bottom. For a long time their wares were made in Japan and shipped into the United States. And they actually are made in other places now, but these are Japanese pieces made in the 1980s. This was a company that really wanted to go beyond what the regular Japanese importers were doing, which was cute and basically kind of inexpensive, and do a little more refined, hand-painted, more sculpted, more detailed wear. And they're really very good. I remember as a kid that we had a high-end department store in Bremerton, Washington called Bremer's, named after the town founder. And that was the place you went for your fancy things, gifts for important people at Christmas, and if you had a nice house, you appointed it there. It was a cut above the chain department stores, and they started carrying these things, and I remember as a kid noticing them and noticing that for Japanese goods, they were really good quality. It really wasn't until the 1970s that the Japanese shook off the reputation for cheap stuff that is a knockoff of something else, and these types of things were the reason why. So, if you want a cheap cigar, this is going to be one of the cheapest you could get. And the reason for that is it's not really meant to be a cigar, it's meant to be a political advertisement for Dewey for president. Thomas Dewey ran and lost against FDR in 1944 and against Harry Truman in 1948, which was the election he was supposed to win, but he managed to blow it at the last minute. Part of it, ironically, was that he was considered a little too highfalutin and not in touch with regular people the way that Truman was. And part of that was that he liked to go around with his perfectly waxed mustache and chomp on his cigar. Wasn't there another president who had trouble with cigars? The cool thing about the Dewey cigar is that it is an interesting piece of political memorabilia now, and they sell for between $15 and $20. So I expect that this being a political season, that usually gets political collectibles in the minds of people again, and I have a feeling that one will go. Dewey ran against FDR, and here we've got FDR and Winston Churchill. And it says at the top, "Hands across the sea," and on the back it has the American and English flags and says "Champions of Democracy." I know we have Carnival glass fans out there, and I know we have a lot of 1960s fans of swung vases, glass that was held upside down and elongated by swinging it back and forth when it was still molten. And then it would make these interesting designs that were all a little different from each other. This piece is actually from the 1910s. This is when we see the beginning of this idea of swung glass vases. Now, this is not a particularly rare pattern. We see a lot of these variations. Most of the companies made them, but they were popular in the 19-teens, and then by the 1920s, people were getting interested in other kinds of glass, and the carnival glass became hard to sell, so they started releasing it as boxfuls of cheap prizes to be given out at carnivals, and that's where the carnival glass name came from. This one is actually green. You can see the color of the glass on the bottom pretty well there. And then the other colors we pay attention to with carnival glass are all the colors in the rainbow effect of the iridescence, which is a mineral oxide that's sprayed on when the glass is almost cool but still hot enough to put a finish on. This particular piece is considered to have pretty good color for carnival glass because it goes from a green, gold, blue into all of the purples, and it's got a very good range of color, and that's important to people who collect carnival glass. They look for this color to see how scarce it is. Green is not a terribly scarce color, and then they look at the color of the iridescence. Now, these pieces don't sell for a ton, probably in the $30 to $35 range these days, but some carnival glass is still very valuable and highly sought after depending on colors and patterns. So this is a really fun, really cool 1950s ashtray by Jimenez, or Jimenez as it probably is correctly pronounced, of Southern California. This is a very obscure small Southern California pottery. After World War II, there were 2,000 potteries in Southern California, and most of them were little mom and pop operations that had one or two lines that they made. These were ahead of their time in that they used a Sgrafitto decoration where they would have the slip applied and then be able to cut through it to the white clay base. So that makes these a little more interesting. That's a very modernist look. This is a Toreador. You might have to look closely. It's a bit Picasso-esque. People love big party-sized ashtrays. Back when cocktail parties and chain smoking were a big thing, these were in every house, and most of them have long gone away. People nowadays usually collect them, wash them, and use them as trays because there's not so many smokers, and most people don't have so many people at their house smoking cigarettes at one time anymore. But it's a fun one. It's got a good paper label on the back, so it tells its origin. And it's also signed because the artist who did it signed it in the slip. I just thought it was really fun. This little set came together as part of a collection from a consignor in Florida. Someone would have had to prepare themselves for shaving back in the old days. You had your cup soap. We've got Colgate here. You would have taken that out and put it in the top. It's a little round bar. Then you'd take your shaving brush, swish it around in the top. It's got holes in it so that the stuff can drain. Then you dab it all over your face and take your straight razor and shave across your face and try not to cut yourself. It was quite an art. I have a friend who still does this. He says it's a much closer shave and he really prefers it. So there are people who buy these to use, but most people just buy them to set in a bathroom or in a display. This one is interesting to me because it has the crest of Torquay in England. If any of you remember the Fawlty Towers television show back in the 70s, that's where that was located. It's on the southern coast facing the straits and facing off towards France and down towards Land's End the other direction. So it's a scenic spot. And there is Torquay Pottery, which was a big collectible from the 1930s to the 1960s made in that area. This is not one of those pieces, and that's why I wanted to show it to you. It is actually a semi-porcelain like an ironstone, but this would have been made somewhere in Staffordshire in England. This is going to be earlier than Torquay Pottery, even though it happens to be labeled Torquay. It is not actually a Torquay Pottery piece, but it is a good collectible shaving mug, and these should sell in the $20 range, typically. $20 to $25 is kind of a general range. And the little brush itself I liked because it's just got this nice clear mottled tortoise shell plastic. This was made in West Germany about the 1950s. You can see a little bit of its original label on there. People who collect shaving brushes often look for Bakelite because those are sometimes some really fun colors and can be rather valuable. But they're also very concerned that the bristles be in good shape because, like I was mentioning, some people still use these. An interesting thing to me about the Peanuts characters is that Charles Schulz said every one of them reflected one aspect of his personality. And Joe Cool was Snoopy's alter ego who was too cool for school. And he's there with Woodstock. They've got their sunglasses on. This is actually made in Korea, according to the label inside, which means it's going to be a late 70s piece. And it's for sunglasses or anything else, maybe a billfold, but you were to wear it on your arm, like an armband. And I thought that was unusual. I hadn't seen this piece before, so I went ahead and got it. And it's up for bid now. I expect that it'll sell in the $10 to $12 range. I put these on a card so you could see them better. On the left is a really cute pin. Some gal would have worn this in 1941, and she was a bowler. I thought that was just cute as could be, and I liked the detail, and it wasn't too expensive, and I thought someone who's a bowler now will really appreciate that. On the right is an I'm for Beatles pin. If your grandmother was a teenager in 1964 when the Beatles came to tour, well, the British invasion just really took off, and she probably has memories of standing and screaming and crying about how wonderful the Beatles were. It was such a phenomenon, it was really unbelievable. They went on the Ed Sullivan Show, and you couldn't hear them because all you could hear were teenage girls screaming at the top of their lungs. Now, a decade later, things had changed, and another English band became popular named Supertramp. This album was called Crime of the Century, a much darker take on things than She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah. But in the mid-70s, there were a lot of social problems, and that was true in Europe as well as in the United States, and this album really reflected that. This is original from a concert at that time. All of these should sell somewhere in the $5 to $15 range. And I don't think I paid more than a couple dollars for any of them. On the other hand, if you were still having fun in the 70s, well then the Budman was there to hang out with you. It was a way to bring an animated mascot into the Budweiser fold, and he particularly was popular with race car fans, and that's why he's got that getup. And Budman stuff is pretty collectible now, especially the early signs and things, but even this little patch, which again was, I think, $1.50 at an estate sale, I imagine is worth $6 to $8. Speaking of race cars, if your Hot Wheels set is missing this guy, which is entirely likely because he got broken and lost very easily out of those race car sets, well, I found a replacement, and I knew what he was. Nobody else who went to the estate sale apparently spotted him, and I thought, oh, someone who collects Hot Wheels will need this. This would date to about 1970. I get asked, how can people get rid of their old photos? Well, a lot of times there's many copies in a family, or it's a branch of the family that petered out and there's no heirs, or they just don't know who the people are because it goes so far back. So when this came up at an estate sale in Florida, I grabbed it because sometimes, as much fun as the family pictures and local interest is, you'll find somebody who had an interesting life. And this guy did one really interesting thing. Here it shows him on board his ship. There's Honolulu, the old territorial capital, in 1920 when practically nobody went to Hawaii because it was expensive. You had to take a steamer, but the military would send you through there on the way to the Philippines. So he got to tour Hawaii. And then he got to serve as part of the 17th Balloon Company in Corregidor in the Philippine Islands. Corregidor became a very famous and brutal place 22 years later when the Japanese invaded, pushed out the Americans, and took control of the Philippines. And Douglas MacArthur promised that we would be back, and indeed we were. And it was liberated in 1945. And finally, by the agreement we'd already had with them, in 1946, they were granted their independence. He got to come home afterwards and have a nice, happy family life, and so there's a lot of fun family photos in here as well. One in particular I wanted to show was this guy here in his cut-down, souped-up, racy-looking Model T. Model Ts were very popular to chop and turn into other types of vehicles and modify. It was the beginning of people modifying vehicles for racing or just for a different look, and it's really cool to see an old picture of an old car that's done that way. People really love finding old photograph books that have interests like this and also that are so well annotated. It's really nice that these people actually did take the time to scrapbook it, told us who the important people in their lives were, and showed us a slice of their life. So I think someone's going to really enjoy having this in their collection. Photography collectors or military collectors, it's got cross-collectible interest. So not sure what to expect as far as the value for this, but I imagine in the $40 to $50 range, potentially more if the right person sees it. Now these I'm just going to give you a glimpse, and I'm selfishly holding them back because I don't find a ton of Christmas and I want to have a neat display and do a whole Christmas theme for you when I can get them all together, but I did find a couple little pieces. The one in my left hand is Treasure Craft of California. I wrote the book on this company. Treasure Craft's Santa line is very difficult to find. It was done in 1953 and 54 only. This is the end of their first era of production. By 1955, the Japanese had taken the market for these little figures, and Treasure Craft had switched to the teak-colored large figurines and TV lamps that matched the new modern furniture that was coming over from Denmark. On the bottom it has the original Treasure Craft label with the treasure chest, the gold label that says Southgate, California, which is where their second factory was located. So you'll notice that it's red glaze rather than red paint because red paint came off easily. It was hard to do red glazes because they fire at a different coefficient of heat than all the other glazes. So typically to do red, you have to do them separately or the other colors will burn off. In this case, what Treasure Craft did is they did the Santa just by himself and then attached him to a separately made green piece using pottery slip to fuse them together. The other thing I find interesting about Treasure Craft's production is that these bisque faces were painted and these were not fired over with the glaze, so they're not shiny, and this actually could wear off if you scrubbed really hard. Those eyes would come right off. The way they did this is they applied Mrs. Stewart's bluing, and when they fired the red glaze in the kiln, all the parts that they painted with the bluing, the glaze wouldn't adhere, so it would just come off and it would come out of the kiln, and anything that wasn't fired was just white, and then they would paint it. It was a very clever way to do it, but it was a multi-step process that was rather expensive. And this little guy is an example of one of the Japanese pieces that soon replaced it. This is Norcrest, and it's got the Norcrest label on the bottom. Norcrest was another importer of Japanese wares. They were based in Portland, Oregon. They had the same problems every other ceramic maker, especially because of the black boots, because black and red really don't like each other in the kiln. They fire at opposite ends of the heat spectrum. They do not fire well together. So what Norcrest did is they cold painted the red. So this red is on the surface of the glaze, over the glaze, meaning it could come off very easily. This would have been made sometime in the late 1950s. It's a very cute little piece. I've never seen this one before, so I imagine that the Treasure Craft piece will value in the $35 to $45 range, and the Norcrest probably in the $25 to $30 range. This will look better on this bracelet stand than it will on my hairy wrist, so I'm going to show it to you this way. This is a scarab bracelet. Scarabs, of course, are an Egyptian form. They're a type of beetle, and they had great significance to the Egyptians. They also had great significance to Americans and people around the world in the 1970s because King Tut's remains and the treasures were sent around the United States and other parts of the world on a world tour. So a lot of people got scarab jewelry about that time. Also popular in the 70s were these glitter lucite candlesticks. Lucite or acrylic, they were made in both. It doesn't seem to matter much to the collectors what they were made of as long as they can find them, because people really like this look again, and it's a great way to have a candle, especially if you want to put them in the window where wax candles will melt and droop. Well, these, you don't dare light them because you'll have melted plastic all over the place, but they look good. Even these little 8-inch ones are selling for about $20 now. The candlesticks are probably in a similar range, around $20. So this was sophisticated plastic from the 70s, and now we're going to show you something, well, a little less sophisticated, which is this lovely memo clip. People were very excited in the 70s by the fact that it was finally not taboo to talk about sex anymore. So they did, a whole lot. And there were a lot of tawdry and fun and slightly naughty things made in the 1970s to celebrate this new liberation. as it was considered in the time. If you stand them up, they just look like they're dancing. So we'll do that to avoid demonetization. Queen Victoria was the ruler of England and the Commonwealth throughout the greater part of the 1800s, and her husband Albert died in the 1860s. She went into a period of mourning at a time when mourning usually lasted for a year. You were expected to wear black, you were expected to be dour, and you were expected to not adorn yourself in any bright or vibrant way, because you were sad and there was a period of respect. Queen Victoria really loved Albert, though, and so unlike a lot of arranged marriages between royals of that generation, she took it really hard, and she stayed in mourning clothes and wore black throughout the remainder of her reign. Because royalty, just as now royalty, celebrities, they lead fashion, well, that was true back then as well, so people wore dark, somber colors for a period of almost 40 years. And when that was over, the Gibson Girl generation, as they came to be known because of the illustrator Gibson who drew a lot of the lovely ladies of the early 1900s, they were thrilled to throw off the black and adopt all white, and things that were bright and colorful and happy were the things people wanted. And that's why you see so much flowery china from about 1910. We'll start with this little piece because this is Theodore Haviland, Limoges, France is the mark. This is a sweet little bowl with 2 tab handles, so a tab-handled bowl. They don't really look like handles, but it does flare out a little at the edge, so that is considered a tab handle. That's how you would have picked it up. This could have been used for anything from sweetmeats to sauces on a table. And you see a nice mark here, Theodore Haviland, and that was one of many makers in the Limoges area of France. You'll notice it has lovely gilding because, again, brightness, and because that's what people wanted, and because Limoges was considered a very high-quality china-making region, all the other makers in the world followed suit, which is where you get this Kpm plate made in Bavaria about the same time. Kpm is a German maker. This has a nice mark on it that you can see, so it's very easy. Now you'll notice, again, it's gilded, but this is not hand-painted. This is transfer gilded. It's a little less expensive. It does have a nice design in the back, but it's not quite as fancy as the Limoges. So the Germans were making slightly less expensive versions of what the French were making, and they remain slightly less expensive today. Now, of course, that generation lived on for many, many years, and so that's why we see these pieces, again, hand-painted. This is Limoges. The gold rim is hand-painted. This is a later Limoges mark you can see on the back here. This is probably right after the Second World War. They're a little thicker and heavier than the old Limoges. That first bowl I showed you has a little bit of a spider crack in it, and that's because it was very thin ware, so it was easy to crack. They decided to make it a little more durable later, so a heavier piece of Limoges is often going to be from a later period. This is a sweet little set of nut dishes, or individual ashtrays as they were also used. The idea is you would give these to people and they could walk around with little hors d'oeuvres at their party without having to hold them in their hands. If your head was full of onions, you would be sad too. This little guy is part of a very wide line by the company DeForest of California. They have a nice mark on the bottom. This ink stamp is usually on their wares. They did all of these types of novelty kitchenwares in the early 1950s. This is actually what Holt Howard and other companies who did pixie ware and similar pieces derived the idea from, because they had a really cute niche and people really enjoy kitchenware. These were always a hit. You don't see them so much anymore because they are popular and most have gone into collections already, but you can still build a pretty nice collection of them if you look online, which is where this guy will be going. I believe the value of these is around $30. Now this looks like a torn sheet of paper, and what in the world would you want with that? Well, when you're going through an estate, you want to make sure you look at torn sheets of paper if you have the time, because if you look at the back of this one, that was a dismissal notice from a job, a termination notice. She said, boring job. Well, she quit the job and she promptly went to a concert because she loved jazz music, apparently. I heard a little bit about this gal's life story. And she had the Mills brothers sign the back of this torn piece of paper. These are the 4 Mills brothers. They were a very popular singing harmony group in the 1940s and 50s. This is where you take something that could have been thrown in the garbage, and probably would have been if I hadn't noticed it, and instead, hopefully someone who loves jazz music and collects these sorts of things will be interested in it, and we save it from a landfill. And it's probably worth about $20. I got a number of knives from an estate sale in St. Petersburg. This one is an Imperial Wildcat Skinner. Imperial was based in Rhode Island, and they were one of the biggest, and for a long time, less expensive of the American knife makers. And I think that's why they outlasted a lot of them. They were good quality still, and a lot of them have survived. This one is called a Wildcat Skinner. This will be a later version from them, probably around 1980. You can tell by the shape of the walnut handle and the fact that it has this place to press to release the blade. It's in good condition. That's very important with pocket knives. It hasn't been ground down or the blade sharpened. That's important to collectors as well. It's not a particularly rare knife, however, so I expect that this again will be a $20 to $25 sale. Here's a couple of more bird figurines by Andrea by Sadek. Mr. Sadek really liked the name Andrea. He had named his daughter Andrea, and he decided to name the line Andrea, which made sense because these were meant primarily to appeal to women. I have several large ones and a few smaller ones which are going to be listed. This was a rather large collection. I believe she had about 15 pieces. So we will see if they can fly away to a new home. I thought these two were particularly nice. The coloration is good. And with the peacock, all of this is hand painted. So they really were good quality. They were definitely a cut above most Japanese figures that had come before them. This little toadstool paperweight I found especially nicely made. This is Murano glass. Murano glass is also called Venetian glass by a lot of people. Technically, the island of Murano is off of the shore of Venice, about 1 mile away. The reason for that is because in the middle Renaissance, when the glassblowing started in Venice, the city fathers did not want the glassblowers to be near the rest of town because glassblowing requires fuel and kilns and lots of heat and fire, and there were many incidents, particularly back then before they had modern firefighting equipment, of glass factories exploding and burning an entire town down. So that's the reason that it really is Murano rather than Venice where the pieces were made. Euphemistically, collectors call it the same thing. This is a 1970s item, and the mushrooms were so popular then. It's good quality, and the white spatter is a neat design. I expect this will sell for $20 to $25. Here I am framed by two lovely ladies, and these are Lenox Ladies. They are from the 1980s and early 90s. Lenox started to send some things offshore. These were made in Malaysia, but the reason for that was it required so much hand painting. And again, as we saw with the Andrea by Sadek pieces, the Asian countries became very good at this type of work, and it was affordable to do. Lenox was trying to compete with Royal Doulton because at that time the lady figures were extremely popular with collectors. This one is Tea at the Ritz. She's supposed to be a Gibson Girl era woman, again, 1910s. You can see the style, the white dress. Look at that wonderful Art Nouveau detail. That would have been an incredible dress if it was a real one. I don't usually do collectibles of this vintage, but it's been 30 years or more since these were made, and so they are actually collectible in their own right. This one is the Grand Tour. She's obviously on the Grand Tour, and this would have been based on the Gaudy fashions from Paris in the 1860s and 70s, right down to the bow on her bustle. Very nice detailing. These really don't sell for a lot compared to what they sold for originally. Originally, these would have been in the $75 to $100 range. You can buy a lot of these now for $30 to $40, and I'd be happy to sell these for that because I do have about 40 from this collection of various types. So we're going to put a few on and see how they do. In my last video from Georgia, I showed you a piece of Venetian glass that had a label that had faded and you couldn't really read it. Well, I just happened in Florida to then come up with this piece, which has the same label with the gondolier from about 1970, and that one you can read. So there it says handmade Venetian. Again, Venetian and Murano are used pretty interchangeably by collectors. This is a modernist piece with the amber color that was popular around 1970. These little fun-shaped bowls, depending on color, can sell anywhere from about $20 to $40. Again, I don't typically do more recent vintage collectibles, but when I see something that says Fabergé, and I know it was made 30 or 40 years ago, well, then I look at it a different way. These are by Franklin Mint. The Fabergé name was licensed to them, and they were supposed to be done in a manner evocative of the Imperial Russian Fabergé eggs. They were not inexpensive when new, and they still sell for pretty good money. These are both music boxes. I have about half a dozen of these, and I also will be listing some individual eggs on stand that are similar. The one on this side here, these have carousel horses. That's the motif she particularly liked, and so she bought several of them. This one is a very pretty purple, and if you look at the detail, the carousel horse is looking into a glass mirror just like you would have on a merry-go-round. On the bottom, we will see the Fabergé mark. Now this one, you wind the top, and this is how the music box plays, and it plays You Are My Sunshine, a very popular tune about 100 years ago. The rainbow motif, I have to say, this horse is definitely ready for gay pride. I guess it's that month, isn't it? I don't think Grandma was thinking that when she bought it. When I was first in the antique business, the Star Center Antique Mall in Snohomish, Washington had a consignment shop downstairs from it, and they sold new collectibles as well, and these were new at that time. Well, that was 1990, which means they're 30 years old now, so they are actually vintage in the Capodimonte style. You can see the marks on the bottom. So they are made in Italy. And that matters because for the people who still collect this sort of stuff, they'd much rather have a Capodimonte related piece made in Italy than something that was made offshore as a knockoff. The detail is pretty incredible. The applied flowers were a big seller for them for many years. And this rose has all its thorns, it has all its petals. You really have to look these over carefully for condition. One little chip devalues them 80 to 90%. Prices on these depend on the day. $25 to $45 is kind of a normal range we see on them these days. It really depends on the motif and how elaborate they are. For you Fire King fans, this is Peach Luster, made about 1960. They made it in a huge variety of dinnerware. The same lines you would see in the jadeite from that era, you will see in the Peach Luster. The mugs, the bowls, the batter bowl. I've got quite a bit of this actually coming up in an estate sale, but this piece was interesting enough that I thought it was worth holding out and trying to sell in a different manner because the luster is still really good. This is, again, a fired on color. You can see that this was milk glass originally, and you can also see that it was $2.50. It does not have the marking on the bottom of this particular piece. I don't think the shells usually do. Most of the other pieces are marked. The nice thing about it is it's got such a great glow. It'd be a great soap dish. It'd be fun in a seaside decor. Luster can wear off. Again, it's very similar to carnival glass. It's an oxide that is fired on while the piece is cooling. So it's not in the glass, it's on the glass. And you always want to look at the bottom of glass. A lot of people mistake cranberry flash for cranberry, for example, because they don't look at the bottom and realize, oh, it's clear glass that someone put a coating on. Well, if you put it in the dishwasher too many times, the coating will start to fade away and then your piece doesn't look great anymore. So they take a little bit more care. But it's a fun shape and I suspect worth in the $10 to $12 range. When you look at these, you might say, oh, he's in trouble. He's got ivory. You can't sell elephant ivory in a lot of jurisdictions across the United States and worldwide now. These were made a little later. These are 1970s or 80s, and they are made out of what they call vegetable ivory. There is a nut in Asia, and they could grind it and make it look like ivory without the expense of ivory, and it was easy to mold and carve. How can you tell? Well, look closely. You do not see a herringbone pattern in the clear parts of the face like you would with ivory. Elephant ivory has a herringbone crosshatch to it. And you can also do it this way. If you hold it to your face and it feels like room temperature, which this does, That tells you this is not a natural material. If it was ivory, it would feel colder than room temperature, and these do not. So these are perfectly legal to buy and sell. Now that people can't legally trade in elephant ivory in most places, these have become more collectible, and the motifs are very meaningful to people who really know Asian art. Every detail in these means something to somebody who knows the Chinese lore behind these. And they have some value. I would say $15 to $20 would be a typical selling price for these, because there is a lot of hand painting and carving that went into them regardless of the fact that they're not ivory. I did get a few soda fountain items. I left the price tags on some of these little things because I get questions about, well, what did you pay for stuff? And a lot of what I sell is on consignment, so in a lot of cases, I didn't buy it. I'm selling it for someone. However, these I picked up at an antique mall. I'm going to do a video from there shortly down in St. Petersburg, Florida, called Andrea and Friends. And these are soda fountain related items. This one is Drink Coca-Cola, this little shot glass here. I didn't pay more than between $1 and $4 for any of these. I think this one with the discount was $3. This one was a toy to keep your kid entertained while you were on the tour of the Martinsville Coca-Cola Bottling Company. And it's got a little wooden thing. Hey, look, I did it the first time. Amazing. I had no idea I could do that. Wow. It's a pencil topper. This would have gone on top of the pencil. This one is Dr. Pepper with the bottle cap. The bottle cap logo for Dr. Pepper went out around the end of the 60s. When bottle caps stopped being used on bottles, Pepsi and Dr. Pepper and Crush and all the companies that had made signs shaped like bottle caps quickly discontinued that because it wasn't modern anymore. Pencil toppers usually sell for, $5 to $8 depending, sometimes more. And then this is a little more unusual in that this was for an employee. Their photo would have been there and this would have been their badge. This is a 1950s design, 50s or early 60s. After that, you really don't see these with the window anymore. So that's a little scarcer. This one says, "A pleasure to serve you, Coca-Cola in bottles." Back in the day, people preferred bottles over cans because they thought it was just a little nicer. Nowadays, people prefer bottles over cans because some people don't like to drink out of plastic or aluminum. So, here's looking at you, kid. Twice, in fact. This is a good piece. If you were a camera collector, or if you were a shutterbug back in the 50s, you wanted one of these. Several companies made them. These are stereo cameras, but Revere was one of, well, the most revered. This is the Revere Stereo 33. I just got a collection of 1,000 cameras approximately, and they range the gamut from 1920s diaphragm cameras to 1990s Nikons. I'm just beginning to go through it all, and I'm not going to go too deep into detail right now because I'm going to do a deeper dive with Patrick over at Trusty Huckster Mercantile in about 10 days. So we'll talk all about cameras there. But this one being a stereo camera and in good condition, you could still shoot film through it. The stereo camera took 2 pictures at the same time, and because they're lenses in different positions, you get a stereo 3D effect when you look at them through slides. It's like Viewmasters, that's how they did theirs. And so this was a novelty for the semi-professional or talented amateur home photographer back at the time. These sell for still $100 to $150 on a good day. Now, most of the time these days, people use these pipes for sets, like Sherlock Holmes in theaters and that sort of stuff. I got a very large collection of old smoking pipes, and I'll spend more time on them, but that's going to be a subject of its own because I have dozens and dozens of them from a consignor now. But this is a really cool looking one. These sell pretty well because it's so iconic. So you want to buy a watch? Because boy, do I have a bunch. I won't show you all of them, but I have a big collection of 1980s vintage diving watches. But this one is the one that is probably the pick of the litter, and that is because it is a Seiko Kinetic. Now, in the 70s, quartz movements became very popular, and the Japanese really took over the market, especially from the Swiss watchmakers, who were very slow to move away from mechanical watches. But some places did not approve of quartz watches, and some people did not enjoy them as much and wanted something that was mechanical still. So Seiko came up with this. It's got a rotor in the back, so it's like an automatic watch. But this is a dive watch. It is water resistant, and this rotor moves around, and that's what actually winds the watch as you're using it, so it does not require a battery at all. The big problem with quartz watches originally was that the batteries didn't last that long. They've improved that a lot over the years, obviously. The Seiko Kinetics usually sell for a few $100s. I'll be curious to see where this one ends up. It appears to be in good working order. Well, thank you so much for being with me again. If there's anything you saw that you liked, many of these pieces are listed on eBay now, and a whole bunch will be dropped on eBay right after this video ends. So take a look. I wanted to give everybody an equal chance because I don't know when people will be seeing this. I did not put this piece on because it does have a little bit of a chip here, but the Kingfisher is a really neat textured circa 1930 pitcher. This was an American-made piece, and it doesn't have any mark on the bottom. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm George the Antique Nomad, at the Antique Nomad on Periscope, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we'll see you soon with more adventures from the world of antiques and vintage. Thank you so much now. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining me again in the fun and fascinating antique community, here where online meets the real world. Please click the subscribe button below. Click the bell to be notified when new videos upload. Leave a comment below and hit thumbs up to like this video. Links to our online social media daily posts and our items for sale are in the description. This is George at the Antique Nomad. Bye for now.